Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and as we ended the Battle of Front Royal, Nathaniel Banks would withdraw from Strasburg, and Jackson went on the offensive again, giving chase to the Federals, as the blue-clad soldiers marched toward Winchester. The morning after the engagement at Front Royal, Jackson didn't know what Banks' next move would be, but he gambled that news would reach the Union commander and that Banks would withdraw. Banks, unlike other Union commanders in the face of a defeat, kept a calm head and realized that with Front Royal taken, he needed to fall back closer to the Potomac River, and Winchester would be his destination. On the morning of May 24th, Banks began moving his troops and supplies toward Winchester. Union soldiers destroyed what could not be carried with them. In front of the main body was a large amount of supply wagons and ambulances carrying wounded soldiers. George Maryland Stuart didn't have a brigade-sized command, so Jackson reinforced his command with cavalry and tasked him with taking the road to Newton north of Front Royal. Ewell's division would march on the more direct route to Winchester to cut off Banks from that town, and Jackson and Ashby traveled to Cedarville on their way toward Middletown. Stuart caught up to the wagon train, overtaking a number of soldiers and wagons. However, Stuart did nothing to halt the advancing Union infantry columns of Williams's division. He and his horsemen rode north, leaving the wagons unhurt and the scattered teamsters and soldiers hiding in the woods along the turnpike. When Banks arrived with the infantry, the Union commander knew now that he was running a gauntlet of Confederate infantry and cavalry as he proceeded down the valley. Williams's infantry deployed against the Confederate cavalry and attacked, dispersing the rebels into the woods surrounding the turnpike. Jackson and Ashby advanced toward Middletown and encountered resistance from Brigadier General John Hatch's cavalry, along with some infantry. During the engagement, Jackson believed Banks was closer to Middletown than he actually was, and ordered Ewell to halt and send him reinforcements. But once Jackson scattered Hatch's men and occupied Middletown, he ordered Ewell to continue toward Winchester. Hatch's delaying action bought Banks a couple of hours, and he arrived in Winchester about sundown. Ewell would arrive late that night. Jackson arrived at Kernstown well after midnight. Both sides were worn out in their race for Winchester. Jackson's quick offensive dismantled the larger Union war effort. On the cusp of the fight at Front Royal, Abraham Lincoln planned for McDowell and Shields to march their combined 40,000 men toward Richmond and link up with George McClellan as he threatened Richmond. However, Banks alerted Lincoln to his own peril, which prompted the president to dispatch Shields back to the Shenandoah Valley, as well as order Fremont out of the mountains to the west into the valley near Harrisonburg to threaten Jackson from the south. Before dawn, Ewell received a single piece of paper with a simple map sketched on it, showing the disposition of Jackson's troops. Beneath the map read, "Attack at daylight." As the Confederate forces prepared for their dawn attack, Banks readied his men as well. The 3rd Wisconsin and 2nd Massachusetts sat west of the turnpike, with the 27th Indiana and 29th Pennsylvania in support. Artillery straddled the turnpike. The 28th New York, 5th Connecticut, and 46th Pennsylvania were on the extreme left of the line, reinforced with artillery. Banks was not fooled by the situation. He knew he was outnumbered, but he wasn't intending to win a great victory. His goal was to delay the Confederates long enough that his supply wagons could make it safely down the valley toward the Potomac to safety. This was a delaying action. The morning dawned and a heavy fog covered the field. One soldier remembered that he couldn't see more than 20 steps ahead. Both Ewell and Jackson's men pressed north toward the Union position. The 21st North Carolina, led by an impetuous colonel, advanced forward in columns of 4 toward the town of Winchester without sending out skirmishers. Worse yet, the fog prevented them from seeing the enemy. Skirmishers from the 1st Maryland Confederate alerted Donnelly's brigade that Confederates were approaching. 46th Pennsylvania and 5th Connecticut withdrew into a ravine and waited to ambush the enemy. Behind them, the 28th New York stood ready to deliver volleys from behind a stone wall. When the Tar Heels came into view, all 3 regiments let loose horrendous volleys. The North Carolinians were stunned and withdrew a short distance to a stone wall. The impetuous colonel unwisely decided to charge the enemy, which only resulted in even more casualties, disabling the regiment, and it quickly retreated back across Abrams Creek. On the Confederate left, Jackson was marching his men up the road and deployed most of the Stonewall Brigade to the west of the turnpike, with the 5th Virginia acting as skirmishers and the 33rd Virginia in reserve. Jackson and Winder were both former artillerymen and sought to use their artillery to their fullest effect. When the two sides began to engage, Jackson placed artillery at both ends of his line, supported by infantry. A devastating artillery duel erupted in between the skirmish lines. One Confederate artilleryman hadn't been with the battery very long. The new recruit would take the place of an exhausted or wounded crew member. When one man became too exhausted to ram the charges, the green soldier rushed up to take his place. Almost as soon as he got to the cannon, a bullet plowed into his head. For 2 hours the Union and Confederate artillery dueled as the infantry skirmished. As more Southern troops approached the town, Jackson and Winder placed them into battle lines and extended the left. As the cannons dueled, the Confederate commander saw Richard Taylor's brigade coming into view. Taylor's men were guided behind the Confederate lines further to the left. Jackson hoped to nearly encircle the Federals with his superior numbers. Taylor's men went behind the Virginians, but at one point the ranks became exposed to Union artillery fire, which wounded several of the Louisianians. Taylor fronted his troops so that they were perpendicular to the Union troops behind the stone wall. Taylor then led his men into the fields west of Winchester, marching in beautiful battle lines toward the flank of the Federal forces. Gordon ordered the 27th Indiana and the 29th Pennsylvania to extend the right of his line and hopefully hold back the 3,000 men from Louisiana. Those two regiments barely made it to their defensive locations before Taylor ordered his men to charge. Wheat's Tigers overlapped the right flank of the Pennsylvanians, capturing around 200 men of the regiment. The 27th Indiana and 2nd Massachusetts began to break first. Gordon attempted to halt the retreating men and form a line, but the superior numbers of the Confederate forces convinced them to keep moving to the rear. As the 29th Pennsylvania and the 3rd Wisconsin pulled back, the 1st Michigan Cavalry rushed forward, attempting to establish a second defensive line on orders from General Williams, but it was too late. It was now close to 8 a.m., and more of Jackson's infantry pushed toward and into the town. On the Union left, Donnelly's men were still confronting Ewell's division. After urging Ewell to let him attack and help Taylor push the Federals back through the town, General Isaac Trimble was given the order to advance with his brigade, but the Federal force in his front had nearly all escaped into the town. Banks's delaying action had worked. Although he had to leave behind a lot of supplies, his wagon train was safely north of town on their way to the Potomac. However, a few wagons still remained, along with wagon loads of supplies from sutlers who followed the army. Jackson's men, instead of pursuing the enemy, pillaged the wagons, many not having eaten for 24 hours. Others were too exhausted to push on further. The women of the town threw rocks, glass bottles, scalding hot water on the retreating Union troops as they made their way out of town. One Union soldier, wounded in the foot, sat down on the steps of a house. The door opened, and the woman of the house asked the soldier if he could walk. He said no. She asked for his pistol, which the beleaguered soldier kindly handed over to her. She took it, pointed at his head, and told him to run. As he limped away, she shot him in the back. Other accounts of women shooting Union soldiers appear in the writings of soldiers who survived the retreat. On at least one occasion, a woman who shot a Federal soldier was shot and mortally wounded herself by his comrades. Banks reached the Potomac with the last of his infantry at about 11 p.m. The Union commander helped push wagons through the mud and save mules from drowning in the deep waters at the Williamsport crossing. It may have been a defeat, but Banks had saved his wagons and many of his men from near disaster at Winchester. Jackson pursued Banks for about 3 miles, but then gave up the chase, being distraught that his cavalry were nowhere in sight. He returned to Winchester, checked himself into the Taylor Hotel, laid down in bed in full uniform, with his boots and even his spurs on, and went immediately to sleep, exhausted from the last few days. The casualties from Winchester is hard to calculate because Banks lumped in those casualties sustained at Front Royal, the march to Winchester, as well as the battle itself. One historian estimates that Banks lost 71 killed, 243 wounded, and 1,714 missing. However, many of those missing later reappeared, having been separated in the retreat and wandered the Virginia countryside for days attempting to find their units. Jackson lost 68 killed, 329 wounded, and 3 missing. The greatest part of the victory at Winchester for Jackson was the 9,354 stands of small arms, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 34,000 pounds of commissary stores, and $125,185 worth of quartermaster supplies. The Union defeat forced Lincoln to rethink the movement of troops around Virginia.